Hi guys, and welcome to your first at-home revision session with me, Mrs. V. We're going to be, in these videos, going over some of the key concepts from lessons to help prepare you for the Unit 1 January exam, which is Psychological Approaches and Applications. Now, in each of the videos, I'm going to split each theory into two separate parts. Part A, which is the key concepts of the theory, and Part B, which is the applications to the context of gender, aggression and consumer behaviour. So in this first video, we're just going to look at learning approach Part A, so going over the key assumptions of the approach, what are some of the general key concepts and terminology that you need to be familiar with, and then we'll look at the evaluation points and how to structure them. I'm also going to be doing another series of videos called 10-Minute Mentor, in which we'll look at shorter specific skill-based videos such as how to plan and write a 9 marker, how to structure evaluation points through writing IECs, and how to do neat paragraphs to help improve the quality of your application questions. But if we start in this knowledge video with looking at the learning approach. Now, the learning approach is a bit of an umbrella term, really, because it's all about understanding how human behaviour is learned. And it's very much based on this idea that we are born as a blank slate, and therefore everything that we are and everything that we do is because of the experiences that we've had in life. So our behaviour is very much shaped by our surroundings, and very much based on that environmental aspect. Now, I've drawn a little umbrella on the whiteboard here. Because it's an umbrella term, that means that in the exam, if it generally uses the word learning approach in a question, then anything that falls under that bracket is relevant. However, sometimes the question might specifically name key concepts within the approach, such as behaviourist theory or social learning, and we need to be able to understand the differences between those concepts so you can access the marks correctly. So the overall assumptions of the approach, which is what I've bullet pointed on top of the umbrella there, these are the 3 or 4 key beliefs and ideas of the approach, the key concepts that we really need to get our heads around. So the first assumption of the approach is that it focuses on observable and measurable behaviour. So this is a very scientific approach that is only interested in observing and measuring behaviour in a scientific way. It believes that we can use animals and apply those same principles to humans. The second assumption of this approach is that we can study animals and humans simultaneously, and we can apply and generalise those kind of behaviours and findings. Another one is that we are born as a blank slate, sometimes what we call the tabula rasa. And all that means is that when we're born, we don't know how to do anything. We don't have any innate biological behaviours. Everything that we do is because of something that has been learned from our environment. So they're kind of the 3 key assumptions of the learning approach more generally. If we then start to look at the concepts separately, we'll start with behaviorism. So within behaviorism, there's 2 main types of conditioning that you need to be aware of. Now, for each of these, we need to be able to define the key terms and then use key studies to help elaborate and give examples of how these concepts have shaped behaviour. So for classical conditioning, this is all about learning through association. So associating a neutral stimulus, so something that to start off with gives no response, pairing that with an unconditioned stimulus, which gives an unconditioned response, and then eventually, after several pairings of these stimuli, it creates a new learned response called the conditioned response. So a good example that you can use from a research study to help you describe that process of classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog study. So in that study, that's where Pavlov had a neutral stimulus of a bell, which gave no response. So the sound of a ringing bell to start off with didn't really cause any change or response in the dog's behaviour. He then wanted to see if he could teach them through association, so through classical conditioning, to start to salivate and drool to the sound of the bell. So he paired together the neutral stimulus of the bell with what we call the unconditioned stimulus of food. Now, food on its own gives an unconditioned response of salivation, We know that when dogs see food, they start drooling, they get excited, they start to salivate at the presence of food being on the table. But by pairing these two stimuli of the food and the bell together, doing that multiple times, eventually the dog starts to learn through association that the sound of the bell means that food's on its way. So when they hear that bell, eventually that becomes the conditioned stimulus, producing a conditioned response of salivation, meaning without the food, the dogs are drooling just at the thought of food coming, so that a new associated behaviour has been learned. Another example that you could use, either in your AO1, so as an extra knowledge example, or you can use that as part of your evaluation, and I'll explain how to do that, is Watson and Rayner's study of little Albert. So again, this is about classical conditioning, but instead of using an animal, such as dogs, this is an example of using a human, so using a baby, and through different pairings of different stimuli and loud noises, they classically conditioned him to develop a phobia of white rats. So classical conditioning is about learning through association. Operant conditioning, however, is about learning through reinforcement. It's about the presence of consequences shaping our behaviour and encouraging us to repeat certain behaviours. Now, there's two different types of conditioning, of reinforcement. You've got positive and you've got negative. So positive reinforcement is all about rewarding behaviour in order to get that repetition response. So for example, you doing really well in a test, your parents or carer providing you with a treat or reward for doing well, that then motivates you to want to do well again. So you repeat that behaviour of carrying on revising to try get another good grade, so you get another reward. Negative reinforcement, however, is about the removal of negative stimuli, again to encourage you to repeat it. So don't see negative reinforcement and think that that's a bad thing. Both positive and negative are good things. Both of them help repeat behaviour. The only difference is, instead of providing a reward, negative reinforcement is about taking away something bad. So I always use the example of, if I've got a headache, I'm likely to take a paracetamol. By taking that paracetamol, it removes the negative stimuli of my headache. So the next time I've got a sore head, I'm likely to take another paracetamol, thus repeating that behaviour. Punishment, however, is a deterrent. Now, punishment is what we do when we want to provide a negative consequence for behaviour so they don't repeat it. So make it clear, reinforcement encourages the repetition of behaviour. Punishment is to make sure we don't repeat it and to kind of almost extinct that behaviour from happening. The key research study you can use for operant condition is Skinner with the rats. So when the rats were placed in the Skinner box, they were either positively reinforced by pressing the lever and receiving a food treat, or they were negatively reinforced by pressing the button to stop the electrical current going through the floor. If we then compare this over to social learning theory, this is still about learning from the environment. They share that common assumption. But instead of it being through association or reinforcement, social learning theorists would suggest it's all about the observation and imitation of role models. It's about watching and copying other people's behaviour and having that desire and motivation to copy it. Now, when we talk about role models, we're referring to somebody that you look up to, somebody that you strongly identify with. And there's kind of three main ways that we can suggest identification has happened. So this is when your role model is similar to you in some way. So it might be that you have the same interests, that person has the job role that you want, you're of a similar age, so some sort of similarity helps identification. Might be that you're even, for example, the same sex or the same gender. You've got to have significance. So the role model can't just be somebody random. It might be somebody that's important to you. For example, a parent, a teacher, a sibling, somebody of some sort of significance. And finally, if they have status, so if it's, for example, a celebrity, somebody with lots of money or power, or who's really accomplished in that area, that sign of status is another thing that might help you identify with them and want to imitate their behaviour. Now, something that really helps that desire to model the behaviour is vicarious reinforcement. Now, this is about rewards, but it's not directly rewarding you. Vicarious reinforcement is when you see your role model be rewarded for a certain behaviour, and that motivates you to observe and imitate that behaviour as well, because you hope to get the same reward. So for example, if a young girl sees her mother putting makeup on and then receiving lots of compliments for looking nice, the little girl might then want to put makeup on in the hope she would also get compliments. So again, you've seen a reward being given to somebody else, and that motivates you to want that same reward and therefore copy them. Now, to touch upon that, we want to emphasise that we don't just blindly copy everything our role model does, okay? If we did that, then we'd be copying pretty much lots of things all of the time, and we know that's not the case. So there must be what we call mediational processes, something in our brain that helps us make that decision and think about whether or not we actually want to copy the behaviour that we're witnessing. And I've broken it down into an acronym of ARM, as in like a long arm. And these 4 components help us identify what are the things that we need to make sure that observation and imitation actually happens. So the first thing is we need to have paid attention. That's what the A stands for. If we don't pay attention to the behaviour, then we can't possibly imitate something we haven't been watching closely. The first R is retention. That just means remember. Yes, you watched the behaviour, but can you remember what they did? Were you actually paying close enough attention that you can recall what they said or how they acted to be able to reproduce it? The next R is about reproduction. And by that we mean, do you have the physical skills or capability to reproduce the behaviour? So I often use the example of a young child whose role model might be Superman or Spider-Man. You know, if a superhero is producing behaviour such as flying or shooting webs out of their hand, a young child doesn't have the physical skills to fly, so therefore can't imitate that particular behaviour. However, a child can throw a punch or a kick, so something that is physically reproducible, that might be imitated, but you've got to have the particular skills to do it. And finally is the M, which is motivation, and that motivation comes from vicarious reinforcement. So from having a reason or a desire to copy the behaviour, often because you've seen your role model be rewarded for it. And then the key research study that you can use to demonstrate your knowledge of social learning theory is Bandura's Bobo doll study. And we use this study throughout learning approach, particularly when we start applying to the context of, say, for example, aggression. So this same study can be utilised in more than one way. But when using it to demonstrate modelling, the key thing to talk about with Bandura's Bobo doll study is that when the children were split into their 2 conditions of observing either a pleasant role model playing nicely with the doll versus an aggressive role model, what was really interesting is it didn't matter which role model they had, whether they'd witnessed adult playing nicely, whether they'd had no role model, or whether they'd had an aggressive role model. Whatever they had witnessed, that's the behaviour they imitated. So the children that had the aggressive role model, they played aggressively with the toys because they'd watched an adult who they identified with playing with the toy in a certain way and then assumed that was how they had to play with it as well. So they imitated that behaviour directly. Additionally, when it was a same-sex role model, so if it was a young boy watching an older man or a young girl watching a woman play with the doll, then the imitation was even more likely. So that emphasises how important identification is when it comes to modelling the behaviour. So then we come on to the AO3 for learning approach part A. And this is where we've introduced these key concepts of AO3 for the first time. And throughout this series, I will keep coming back to the same 3 evaluation themes of scientific, oversimplistic, and nature versus nurture debate. So in a 9 marker, we're looking for a maximum of 2 evaluation paragraphs, 1 strength, 1 weakness, with a short conclusion at the bottom to get in top band. If you've got time, push for that third evaluation, or you can kind of choose which evaluation points you use. But we give you 3 so that you have a little bit of flexibility, and those aiming for that distinction star can add in an additional point. So if we start with scientific, this is a strength of the learning approach, because if we look at the assumptions, it says that this approach only focuses on observable and measurable behaviour, meaning it uses really scientific research methods in the studies, such as lab experiments. It's all about being able to measure behaviour. So for example, I can physically see when a dog is presented with a bell or food, I can physically observe and measure that impact. In Pavlov's study, he measured the dog's saliva in millilitres. That's in a unit that's been clearly operationalised. So it's easy for us to say, because of the scientific methods used to study the learning approach, it is scientific. But I would, in your evaluation point, use one of the 3 studies that we've learned in our AO1 to provide an example. So in the booklet, we use the example of Watson and Rayner's Little Albert study, because we could physically observe when the child was being presented with the different stimuli and measure how the phobia was developed. But if you can't remember the Watson and Rayner Little Albert example, use Pavlov instead. That's still an example of how a study within learning theory is scientific. And if it's scientific, it's more valid, so it's an accurate theory. It helps us establish cause and effect relationships between the behaviour and the concept of learning. Or you can use Bandura's Bobo doll study. The only thing I would kind of hint is that if the question specifically asks you to evaluate social learning theory, then you would have to use the Bobo doll experiment as your example for scientific. Equally, if the question specifically asks you to evaluate behaviorism, I would make sure that I used either Pavlov or Watson and Rayner as my example. So the point stays the same. The only bit that changes is which study you use as your example, depending on the wording of the question. The next evaluation point is about oversimplistic. So this is the idea that if we are focusing just purely on learnt behaviour, then there's lots of things that are being ignored and it's too simple of an explanation. It's reducing down something really complex like the whole of human behaviour down to just one theory or one belief. And often that simplicity means it's not a complete or what we call holistic explanation. So I think in the booklet for part A, we used the example of phobias. We kept that same example. And we said that if learning approach says we can learn through classical conditioning to be afraid of things, that's ignoring all of the other factors, such as biology, that could play a role. So there's certain phobias that we have evolved over time to be afraid of, because if we have a phobia of something, we avoid it. So the key concept there is that by not acknowledging all of these other factors, such as the role of biology, the role of cognition, the role of social factors, so this is where you can compare and contrast to the other theories, it's not giving us that best explanation. And then finally, nature versus nurture is when we compare, well, in the nature-nurture debate, which side of the fence does this theory sit on? And because learning approach is all about the environment and not biological factors, this is very much a nurture-based approach, all about what we learn and develop from the environment. So whilst that's a good thing, because it can be scientific and it studies it in great depth, it fails to consider the other side of the argument. And the best thing is what we call an interactionist one. So one that acknowledges that certain behaviours are predisposed through biology, but the environment has to play a role as well. So it's all about the combination or the interaction of the two. Now that's quite a tricky point to get his head around, and I am going to do, like I said, a separate video just going over the 3 IECs, how to write them, how to remember them, tips and tricks with how to elaborate and give examples. So in that kind of 10-minute mentor video that I'll post probably next week, I will look a little bit deeper into the skill of writing AO3. But for now, if when you're revising, you remember those 3 themes of scientific as a strength and then oversimplistic and nature versus nurture as your weaknesses, then you've got the 3 key points there You just will then need to build on your explain and your conclusion when it comes to writing AO3. So hopefully that whistle-stop tour is just giving you a little reminder as to what key terms and concepts are within Part A, and making sure you solidly understand the foundations of learning theory. And then when it comes to Part B, we'll look at how can you take your knowledge of classical and operant conditioning or social learning, how can you take those concepts and apply it to the development of gender, to consumer behaviour and marketing products, or kind of business psychology, or how we can use studies like Bandura's Bobo doll study to explain the types of aggression. So if you've got any specific questions, comment down below. Please keep an eye on the Instagram stories. I'm going to be posting kind of tips and tricks and then links to future videos. And I look forward to seeing you in part 2.